This is Joseph Stalin, the tyrannical dictator of the USSR whose rule was built off of fear and ideological brainwashing. The legacy of his actions have cast a shadow over modern history. Wait, what do you do? No, I take it back. Stalin was a complex figure. He was a small, uninspiring, and sickly man who was somehow able to rule the largest country on earth simply by sheer brutality. Born to a devout and poor family in rural Georgia, not that Georgia, he never should have ruled, but he did. And just like figures in the 20th century like Hitler, FDR, and Churchill, him being in his place at this time in history changed everything. And the only way to truly know how different the world would be without Stalin is to take him out of it. And so that's why I have a scenario. What if Stalin never came to power? Well, before I can discuss that, here's some historical context. Now, if you already know all of this history, just click here and skip to the scenario. Go ahead. Do it. Personal stuff. Oversimplifying the first 20-something years of his life, little Stalin was born in Georgia under the Russian Empire, living with his parents in a poor household. His real name was... His mother wished for him to become a priest, and he received a scholarship to go to the Tilthy Spiritual Seminary. It was here where he began reading the controversial views of Karl Marx, and ironically became an atheist. At this point in his life, in 1901, Stalin began running with a different crowd, as in an underground revolutionary Bolshevik movement bent on bringing down a corrupt autocracy. You know, kid stuff. After reading the works of Vladimir Lenin, Stalin wanted to hop on board, and quickly became comrades, with Vladimir himself. The Bolsheviks at this time were very underground, so much so they pulled off bank heists to get money to fund their operation. Stalin really doesn't do anything except work for the cause. For the next 17 years, the Bolsheviks would slowly become prominent as anger and distrust rose against the Tsar's regime. Well, it's that time of the century, World War I, and Russia is preparing to go kill some Germans, and then they don't. This brutal and pointless war leaves the Tsar in a pretty bad position with the people, who are growing more restless. 1917 comes by, and Lenin, who has been in exile for years, finally returns back to the motherland, and the revolution can begin. Yay! Yes, I know this is a vast oversimplification. Check out my Russian Revolution video if you want to brush up on that history. Russia drops out of World War I, and now the Russian Civil War has begun. Communists versus non-communists. Day versus night. Batman versus Superman. In the fighting, Lenin formed the Politburo, which were the main central leaders for the future Soviet Union. It was a small group, but the only names you really need to remember are Lenin, Stalin, and Leon Trotsky. Trotsky is the main guy we need to focus on. Without Stalin, he is the obvious replacement. Why? Because he was supposed to be. Who is Leon Trotsky? Trotsky grew up in Odessa, where he grew discontent with the Tsar's regime, its anti-Semitic policies, and hardship against the working class. There, he wrote about his communist sympathies as a journalist, and was arrested at the age of 18. This is actually where his pen name came to be. Trotsky was the name of his prison guard. He fled to London, where he met Vladimir Lenin, and they edited a communist paper together. He fell out with Lenin when they split in ideology, which happens a lot with revolutionaries. In 1905, he went hardcore, so to say, vowing to literally fight the Tsar after his return in St. Petersburg and joining the Soviet, a workers' council in the city. This revolution was put down hard, and Trotsky was arrested again, but he was able to escape, once again going on the run in exile. For Trotsky, he believed that communism should be universal. He wanted a revolution that spanned across the world, not just in Russia. For the next decade, Trotsky was in exile, living from city to city, writing his communist ideals, becoming a celebrity of sorts. He fought with Lenin and the Bolshevik ideas who wanted a more centralized party, while Trotsky wanted a looser and larger one. Once revolution erupted in 1917, Trotsky found his opportunity to return. Him and Lenin traveled back to Russia to lead the fight. Returning to Russia, Trotsky and Lenin rebuilt their relationship and became allies, because when everyone wants to kill you, you kinda have to. Almost immediately, supporters of the Tsar, or anyone not wanting a communist state, declared war against the new Bolshevik regime, and the war had begun. Trotsky was charismatic and an extreme idealist. Only reason I bring this up is because this is everything Stalin is not. Trotsky, with his revolutionary zeal, was put in charge of the Red Army. The resulting war was horrific. Atrocities occurred by both sides, many ordered by Trotsky himself to destroy any opposition. The communists were on the defense in many periods, and defeat was always at the door. Do not think for a second Trotsky was a pure angel. Of course, with our viewing glasses from the 21st century, anyone seems better than Stalin, but still Trotsky was a fanatic, extreme revolutionary. While Stalin was brutal in securing his own personal control, Trotsky would kill to maintain the dominance of the party. For him, blood was required to secure the Soviet Union. As the war deteriorated, this blood was spilt more and more frequently. To the opposition, he was deemed a butcher. After 3 years of war and revolution, the Red Army finally won against the White. Millions had died and starved to death. The country was in ruins. But the Soviet Union, the first of its kind, was secure. Lenin was under bad health, and now the talk of a successor had begun. Trotsky to the world and Russia was always seen as the obvious choice. He was the right hand of Lenin, leader of the Red Army, and face of the revolution. But an upset occurred. Instead, Joseph Stalin, power-hungry and at this time in the shadows, had manipulated control to grow his support from within the party. Within a few years, Stalin's grip on the USSR was absolutely secure, and Trotsky was thrown out of the country. He lived the rest of his life in Mexico, where his influence as a writer and glimmer of hope of what could have been became a threat to Stalin, who ordered him assassinated in 1940. 1 year later, Hitler would invade Russia. For many, Trotsky is seen as an alternative, which was one of the reasons why he was killed. His fall resulted in the rise of a dictator whose policies killed millions of his own people, whose grip hijacked the Bolshevik Revolution into a cult of personality no different than Mussolini or Hitler, who'd he ironically fight against. So, as is tradition, what if in this alternate timeline, Trotsky had replaced Lenin? What if Stalin just never came to power? In our timeline, Lenin wrote that Stalin was power-hungry and should not become his successor. Trotsky should have used this initiative to destroy Stalin's power base, but instead he did nothing. In this alternate timeline, Trotsky seizes the opportunity and publishes Lenin's opinions that validate him and discredit Stalin, basically stopping that little power grab in its tracks. If this doesn't work, then some other alternate reason occurs why Stalin doesn't get into power. I don't know, we have a lot to cover. Point is, Stalin out, Trotsky in. While freedom-loving Americans such as myself love capitalism and barbecues and all that freedom entails, many often lump communism into a single ideology. Just like you wouldn't think Democrats and Republicans love each other just because they agree on democracy, same thing with the Soviet Union. The difference between Trotsky and Stalin is not just in Stalin ends up killing millions of people. Both had a different mindset on how to achieve communism and what it should play on the world. Stalin had an idea called socialism in one country. To sum it all up, everyone wants to kill us, so why try to expand? Which wasn't particularly untrue, considering how every European and Western power funded the White Army. Stalin believed that since socialist uprisings failed in Europe, the best course of action was to not focus on a world revolution, but to maintain what they already have. And what do they already have? Stalin. So, keep me in power. Trotsky and his followers, who happened to follow Trotskyism, very much disagreed with this idea. Communism as an end goal isn't supposed to have borders, so this one country approach didn't go over too well. They were more traditionalists, believing in Marx and Lenin's idea that workers all around the world will unite, and global communism will be a natural thing. Trotsky, as a hardcore revolutionary, believed the Soviets must fund socialist uprisings across the world to make this happen. In this alternate timeline, the Soviet Union does not go down the path of Stalinism, no duh, but instead goes down the path of Trotskyism. What's this change? A whole lot. Of course, in a scenario, not everything can be accurately predicted, so every tenet of Trotskyism might not be followed, maybe because of opposition, or just it doesn't work that way. But for the sake of the scenario, let's say it does. In our timeline, Stalinism brought the USSR immediately into an age of autocratic authoritarianism, where paranoia and brutality reigned supreme. Just as the Nazis expelled and destroyed any opposition, immediately a cult of personality circulated around Stalin. Purges on an immense scale hunted down old Bolsheviks who had disagreed with him to extinction. Anyone and everyone who was a potential threat was either shot or sent to the gulags. In this alternate timeline, the Soviet Union is not one authoritarian centralized state. It's not comparative to a republic like the US or Western Europe, but it isn't this state of immense political death. The phrase dictatorship of the proletariat didn't actually mean a dictatorship. Under Trotsky, what is instead implemented is Soviet democracy. In this alternate scenario, the Soviet Union is made up of numerous democratically elected worker councils, Soviets, who would elect their own representatives to the larger Council of Soviets. It's almost like a union of Soviets. This was what was meant by a dictatorship. Instead of nobles, capitalists, or priests making the decisions in Trotsky's mind, the working class was the main body in charge. I can't really say if this state would be effective, but that's what the original plan was supposed to be. Not one guy controls everything, but the party does. Wow, you say? That doesn't sound completely terrible. Yeah, but also keep in mind this is Trotsky we're talking about, the believer that the revolution never ends. The Soviet Union becomes the supplier of socialist rebellions across the world. A good modern equivalent today is Saudi Arabia. That's a story for another day. The Soviet Union uses its strength to fund militant groups, communist parties, socialists of all kinds across the world. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union turned its back on these revolutionaries, except for in Spain. With the socialism in one country idea under Stalin, the Soviet Union was only supposed to preserve itself, or, simply put, Stalin wanted to preserve Stalin. With Trotsky as leader, the USSR takes a more selfless approach, for lack of better words. The constant revolution must be achieved. Now, whether they succeed in doing this in this alternate timeline is up to your opinion. But what this realistically does is, 1. Makes the USSR far more antagonistic to the West than in our timeline when Stalin was focused on his people, 2. Drains a whole lot of USSR resources, and 3. Pisses off a lot of people. Under Trotskyism, the USSR is a much more prominent antagonist in the 1930s. Oh, so like how the Soviets created the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War, you say? No, this is an entirely different mentality. That whole takeover post-World War II Iron Curtain funding communist regimes in Asia wasn't for the noble idea of spreading a socialist utopia. It was to create a buffer zone against Russia's enemies. This mentality was born with Stalin. In this alternate timeline, Soviet foreign policy is extremely combative and zealous, but doesn't prioritize Russia's safety over others. This was Lenin's main idea, and with Trotsky, it would continue. And what better way for the workers of the world to unite than a global depression? Internationally, by the time the 1930s come around, the Soviets have a much stronger priority on getting communist revolutions going against the capitalist West, basically kicking it while it's down. Trotsky never wanted to negotiate with the capitalists. Of course, they didn't use all of their resources to fund people, but they certainly do more damage than Stalin did. In our timeline, Stalin was a paranoid nutcase. He saw everyone and everything as a potential threat. But what he most distrusted was the outside world, and believed that the USSR would be annihilated by the capitalist powers if it didn't industrialize. He believed that a war would occur at some point, and that the USSR must move decades ahead technologically if it was to survive. Problem was, most of Russia looked like this. Across the 1930s, 5-year plans reinvented Russian society. It took a nation that a generation before was in practical feudalism and brought it into the 20th century, kicking and screaming. And by kicking and screaming, I mean the most heartless policies that resulted in millions starving to death. So, what happens in this alternate timeline? Hitler still rises to power in Germany. The Nazis still have the idea of Lebensraum, and no matter who is in charge of Russia, Germany still wants that land. Well, in this alternate timeline, those 5-year plans still happen. Millions potentially still die, because industrialization was Trotsky's original idea, not Stalin's. Stalin just stole that after he kicked Trotsky out. So in this scenario, we could actually see an industrial Red Army, just like in our timeline. So then, what's the main difference? Stalin was an idiot. He was such an idiot, he thought he could trust a regime who rose from the explicit hatred of communism. Before 1941, Hitler and Stalin had a bit of an alliance after invading, raping, and massacring the Poles between them. Most Russians with common sense saw that Hitler couldn't be trusted. In fact, many people reported that the Nazis were preparing an invasion. But Stalin did nothing. Trotsky, on the other hand, saw the danger that Nazism truly was. The intense anti-communist rhetoric, the violent ideology, the "hey, we're going to take your land" thing. In this alternate timeline, I believe Trotsky would not have sat back and allowed the Nazis to dictate the war on their own terms. In this alternate timeline, it would be the USSR that would invade Nazi Germany, not the other way around. Trotsky, although he was an intellectual and believed in a less authoritarian way of governing, was still brutal. He led the Red Army for a reason, and if he was in charge, Russia never would have sat back. In this scenario, instead of the Nazis' quote, surprise attack on Russia, the Soviet Union invades Poland and Germany. The specifics of such a war I can't really predict, but without the stupidity of Stalin at the top, the Soviet Red Army is a far more effective and terrifying tool against the Germans. However, they could be too effective. The Soviet Union could establish a series of communist regimes just like in our timeline, but across Germany instead. Now, see this from the perspective of the Allies. Under Trotsky, the Soviet Union has funded international communist rebellions against countries like France, Britain, and America. They are the closest to enemies you can get. While Nazi Germany was certainly horrible, this communist nation, which nobody is allies with, has invaded and spread their ideology across the entire European continent. What would you do? Well, in our timeline, Churchill wanted to fight the Soviets even after World War II. So in this alternate timeline, the West probably wouldn't be all hunky-dory about Trotsky's Red Army plowing through Germany. In this alternate scenario, fascism, while it was bad, lived too short of a life to be a massive threat in comparison, while communism was a decades-old enemy. We could see an actual World War II, but between the Soviet Union and the West. This has many ramifications. 1. If the Russians invaded Germany, they would push a very large Nazi population underground. The fears of the Nazis and the far right would be legitimized, and without the war crimes and horrors of the Holocaust, fascism is never discredited, but instead is martyred. 2. Britain, France, the United States, Italy, and underground anti-communist movements across Europe fight a war against the Soviets. I can't predict how long this war would be or how many would be killed by it, but you have to think everyone is fighting the Russians. Perhaps Russia is pushed out of Europe. Perhaps the West decides to overthrow the source of international communism. This means another land war against Russia, but instead of the Nazis, it's Brits, French, Germans, and Americans all fighting together. In this alternate timeline, fascism is never killed. It remains a legitimized and often popular alternative in Western society. The Cold War never occurs because it already got hot. The political relationships of post-World War II are entirely changed in ways I can't even predict. Trotsky was not a saint. He was like Stalin in many ways, but he was also less authoritarian and more idealistic. Had he been in power, he would have been a hero to many, and most likely one of the most hated men in history. Millions still would die of hunger under his regime, potential millions from a war he could start. What this scenario shows is that without Trotsky, the 20th century entirely changes. The greatest generation, modern culture, all from one guy 80 years ago, getting booted out of his job. This is just one scenario about what if Stalin never came to power. We'll never truly know how things could have changed, yet it's fun to theorize. What do you think could have happened in this alternate timeline? Say in the comments. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub. Special thanks to Jonathan Campbell who suggested this video idea. If you want to learn more about Russia and World War II, I made an entire series about Allied and Russian tanks on my second channel, Knowledge Hub, so go check that out.